On a chill October morning, when the London fog hung low over the city like a dirty grey veil, Dr. John Watson found himself once more ascending the familiar steps to 221B Baker Street. It was 8:15 by his watch, and the street outside still bore the hush of early hours, disturbed only by the clatter of a distant milk cart and the occasional clop of a passing cab. Within, however, there was already movement. Mrs. Hudson, with an anxious expression that seemed more than usually pronounced, greeted him in the hallway. "Good morning, Doctor," she said. "You've come early, sir. Mr. Holmes will be glad of it, I'm sure." "Holmes is up, then?" Watson asked, removing his hat and coat. "Up and pacing," she replied with a sigh. "And twice, mind you," I've heard him laugh to himself. "That's never a comfortable sound at breakfast time." Watson smiled faintly. "Then some problem has presented itself and he already scents the chase. I shall go to him at once." Mrs. Hudson lowered her voice. "And there's a gentleman waiting upon him, a clergyman, by the look of him. Come in a great state about something dreadful in a churchyard, so he says." "A churchyard?" Watson repeated, his interest quickening. "Thank you, Mrs. Hudson." He mounted the final flight and pushed open the door to the sitting room which had been the scene of so many singular discussions and remarkable revelations. The fire crackled cheerfully in the grate, fighting back the invasive cold pressing against the window panes. A faint haze of tobacco smoke hung in the air, through which the long, spare figure of Sherlock Holmes could be discerned. Standing with his back to the fire, his hands clasped behind him, his aquiline profile turned towards their visitor. The latter was, as Mrs. Hudson had said, a clergyman, middle-aged, thin, with a careworn face and a stoop, born of study or worry. His black frock coat was spattered with mud about the hem, and his gloves, which lay upon the table, bore faint traces of damp earth. His hat, placed beside them, was beaded with droplets of fog, as though he had come some distance that morning. Holmes glanced up as Watson entered. "Ah, Watson," said he, in that dry, incisive tone which always held a trace of good-humoured mockery. "You arrive, as ever, when you are most needed. Allow me to present the Reverend Mr. Elias Chislehurst, Vicar of St. Luke's, Highgate. Mr. Chislehurst, this is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson." The clergyman rose and bowed with the solemnity of one whose mind is elsewhere. "I have read of your exploits, Doctor," he said. "In the Strand magazine. I confess I did not think I should ever find myself a character in such an account." "That remains to be seen," Holmes murmured. "Pray be seated, Watson. Our guest brings us a problem which by his own account concerns a matter both sacred and scandalous." The vicar clasped his long, pale hands together upon his knee and stared into the fire as if drawing courage from it. "It is not merely scandal, Mr. Holmes," he said in a low voice. "If what I have seen is not the work of men, then it must be something far more dreadful." Holmes's grey eyes gleamed with interest. "You hear, Watson?" he remarked. "We stand, it appears, upon the borderland between the natural and the supernatural. It is our task to push that border back into the proper place." He inclined his head to the vicar. "You spoke in your note of a grave that moved. Perhaps you will now favour us with the whole of the circumstances from the beginning, and with as little omission as possible." The clergyman swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly in his throat. "Yes, of course. It concerns the churchyard of St. Luke's, which adjoins our chapel. It is a small place, enclosed by a low stone wall and several great yew trees. We are not a large parish, Mr. Holmes, but we are an old one. Some of the stones in that ground bear dates from the last century. 3 days ago, I officiated at the burial of a gentleman by the name of Sir Jasper Meakins, a retired civil servant who had served in India and returned to London some years past. He was a widower without children, and his nearest relation is a niece, Miss Clara Meekins, who resides in Bloomsbury. It was Miss Meekins who arranged the funeral and who chose the plot, a new plot, near the western wall of the churchyard. I remember the burial distinctly. The grave was dug under my supervision. I read the service. The coffin, of oak with brass handles, was lowered and properly covered. The stone, a temporary wooden marker, pending the carving of the final monument, was placed at the head. Sir Jasper Meekins, KCIE, born 1827, died 1890, requiescat in pace. There was nothing out of the ordinary about it. I left the churchyard at 4 o'clock that afternoon. He paused, his fingers tightening slightly. The following morning, I was called from my breakfast by our sexton, old Matthew Carr. He is a man in whom I have complete trust, steady, sober, and a lifelong member of the parish. He came to the vicarage door quite white and shaking, insisting that I come at once. I supposed at first that some boy had broken the railings again, but when we reached the yard... Holmes inclined his head slightly, urging him on. "The grave was gone," said the clergyman. Watson, who had been following the narrative with increasing interest, started in his chair. "Gone," he repeated. "Do you mean that the earth had been disturbed, that the coffin had been taken?" "No, doctor." The vicar turned towards him with an expression of mingled horror and bewilderment. "I mean that the grave had vanished, only to reappear some 20 yards away." There was a brief silence in the sitting-room, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock upon the mantelpiece. "Pray be more explicit, Mr. Chislehurst," said Holmes at last. "You assert that the grave, complete, had been moved?" "As God is my witness, Mr. Holmes, that is what I saw." The vicar leaned forward, his voice intense. Where, the previous afternoon, there had been freshly turned earth in the new plot, there was now only turf. Old turf with grass grown thick upon it. No sign of disturbance that I or the sexton could perceive. And in another part of the yard, where there had been only grass before, there was now a mound of newly turned soil with the very same wooden marker at its head. It bore the name and dates of Sir Jasper Meekins, and the ground was as freshly dug as if we had only just laid him there. Watson could not restrain a soft exclamation. "But that is impossible," he protested. "A grave, with its contents, cannot simply move itself across a churchyard in the night. There must be some trick, some elaborate sacrilege." Holmes's long fingers drummed lightly against the side of his teacup. "You observed the second grave closely, I trust?" he asked. "I did," said the clergyman. "The dimensions were precisely the same. The soil, loamy, dark, looked no different from that of the original plot. The coffin-lowering straps had left their usual marks along the sides. Even the small clod of clay which had fallen upon the temporary marker, I recall knocking it away with my hand the day before. It lay in the same position, as though it had never been disturbed." "And the original plot," Holmes said. "You say the turf had been restored there?" "Yes, that is the strangest thing of all. It looked as though no grave had ever been dug. The grass was somewhat yellowed, perhaps, but there were no spades marks, no loose earth. It was as if the grave had been erased." Holmes's eyes half closed. "And your sexton?" he asked. "Did he see or hear anything during the night?" "Carr swears that he locked the churchyard gate at dusk, as is his habit." The vicar shook his head. "He lives in the small cottage at the far corner of the grounds, near the east wall. He heard nothing. No footsteps, no cartwheels, nothing out of the ordinary. He is an old man and sleeps somewhat heavily, but it is hard to imagine that men could have exhumed a coffin, carried it across the yard, filled in one grave, dug another, and lowered it again, all in a few hours without any sound reaching him. And yet, Holmes observed quietly, the facts suggest that something of that nature occurred. Reverend Chislehurst's lips tightened. That is precisely why I came to you, Mr. Holmes. If it is the work of sacrilegious men, then we are dealing with a blasphemy of the most deliberate and calculated kind, and if it is not— His gaze flickered uneasily towards the window, beyond which the fog pressed like some ghostly presence. Then I confess, I do not know what we are dealing with. There is always a human hand, Holmes said, almost absently. The laws of nature are not so easily set aside, even in a churchyard. There is more, the vicar continued after a moment. I would not trouble you merely for the sake of one strange incident, however disturbing, but last night, on the second night since the burial, something else occurred. Holmes straightened slightly. Ah, he murmured, the grave moved again. Even Holmes, whose demeanour seldom betrayed surprise, allowed his brows to lift at this. Again, he said. Yes. Yesterday morning, after we discovered the change, I telegraphed Miss Meekins in Bloomsbury, informing her of the disturbance, and assuring her that I should take every measure to protect her uncle's resting place. I also notified the local constable, though he seemed more inclined to attribute the matter to my imagination than to fact. Last night I insisted upon remaining in the churchyard myself. I took a lamp and a small chair, and sat within sight of the grave from 9 o'clock until midnight. The fog was very thick, and the chill— He shuddered slightly at the recollection. I heard nothing, save the hoot of an owl and the occasional distant rumble of a carriage on the Highgate Road. At midnight, I confess, I could stand no more, and returned to the vicarage to warm myself. Carr promised me he would look out once more before retiring. This morning, when I returned at 7, the grave was no longer where it had been when I left it. It had moved again, Mr. Holmes, not as far this time, perhaps 10 yards closer to the church door. The earth was freshly turned once more, and another part of the yard, which had been bare, now shows no sign that a grave was ever there. He buried his face briefly in his hands. I am a man of faith, Mr. Holmes, but I am also a man of sense. I do not believe in walking graves or restless coffins, and yet I am confronted with a phenomenon which I cannot reconcile with reason. Holmes moved away from the fire and crossed to the window, where he stood for a moment looking out into the murky street. His figure, silhouetted against the pale light, had an air of lean, predatory energy. A grave that shifts its position, leaving no evidence of disturbance at the prior site, he said softly. A coffin, presumably, that travels beneath the very noses of those charged with guarding it. And all this centred on a certain Sir Jasper Meekins, late of the Indian Civil Service. He turned, suddenly, his eyes keen. Tell me, Mr. Chislehurst, what do you know of Sir Jasper's life, and more importantly, of his death? The clergyman hesitated. Very little, I fear. He was not one of my regular parishioners, though he attended a few services in the months preceding his demise. I understand he had lived quietly in Highgate for some years, seldom venturing into society. His niece might know more. As to his death, I was informed that it was of natural causes, a sudden seizure in the night. The doctor who attended him is a respectable man, and he signed the certificate without hesitation. Holmes's fingers steepled together. No hint of scandal? He asked. No whispers of strange behaviour, of enemies, of debts, of, shall we say, irregularities in his past? Not that I have heard, the vicar replied. He seemed a courteous, rather melancholy gentleman, reserved, but not unkind. He made a modest donation to the parish poor box upon his first visit. There was nothing whatever in his demeanour to suggest this. Holmes' gaze sharpened at some point in the vicar's words, though Watson could not at once discern which. "And Miss Meekins?" Holmes asked. "How does she take these occurrences?" "I cannot say. I have not yet told her of the second movement. Her first telegram in reply to mine expressed shock and distress naturally. She is, I believe, of a nervous disposition. I did not wish to alarm her further until I could give some hope of an explanation." Holmes nodded slowly. "You were right to come to me," he said. "This is, I admit, one of the more singular problems that has crossed my path. A grave that wanders is a novelty, even in my experience." He glanced at the clock. "If you can spare the time from your pastoral duties, Mr. Chislehurst, I suggest that we accompany you back to Highgate this very morning. I should like to see this peripatetic grave with my own eyes before it develops any further migratory habits." A flicker of relief passed over the clergyman's strained features. "I shall be profoundly grateful for your assistance, Mr. Holmes," he said earnestly. "The carriage which brought me here is waiting still in Baker Street. We may depart as soon as you wish." Holmes turned to Watson, the ghost of a smile at the corners of his mouth. "You perceive, Watson," he remarked, "that London contrives to entertain us even when the season is at its dullest. Here we have, within the space of a churchyard, a problem involving displacement, concealment, and, if I am not mistaken, a singularly human motive. Will you favour me with your company?" Watson's heart, which had already begun to beat more quickly at the prospect, needed no further urging. "Most certainly, Holmes," he replied. Holmes reached for his hat and the long grey overcoat which hung upon the peg by the door. "Then we shall see," he said, "whether the dead of Highgate have indeed taken to walking, or whether some very lively intelligence is at work among them." With that, the three men descended the stairs together, and within a few minutes more the clatter of wheels upon the cobbles announced that Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson were once again on the trail of a mystery which at first glance defied all reason. The fog had thickened while we spoke, so that when we emerged into Baker Street, the houses on the opposite side were but vague shadows in a grey sea. The vicar's hired carriage waited by the curb, its horse steaming faintly in the cold, and we took our places within, Holmes and I opposite the Reverend Chislehurst, who clutched his umbrella between his knees like a man holding fast to something solid in a world suddenly made uncertain. We rattled off through the murky streets, the great city only half awake about us. Holmes, sunk into his corner, appeared to be dozing, but I had long since learned that this languor was often but a mask for the most active mental processes. Presently his eyes opened, and I saw in them that cool, analytic light which betokened that his mind had already leapt far ahead into possibilities and conjectures. "You have had an early start, Mr. Chislehurst," he remarked suddenly. The vicar glanced up, startled. "Why, yes, Mr. Holmes. I left Highgate little after 7. "And you packed in some haste," Holmes added, in the same indifferent tone. "Your right sleeve bears a faint smear of lampblack, such as might come from a hastily refilled lantern, and your left cuff is frayed where it has caught more than once upon some rough edge, say the splintered wood of a churchyard gate. You have, in short, been making a habit of nocturnal vigils these last 2 nights." Our companion stared at him, his lips soundlessly forming the beginnings of a question. "I did not mention my remaining in the churchyard except on the last night," he said at last. "Yet, I confess, on the night before I also looked in upon the grave twice. How could you possibly—" Holmes waved a languid hand. "The fog is unforgiving," he said. It clings to the garments and retains the tale of a man's movements in its damp memory. You carry your parish with you, Mr. Chislehurst. The clergyman glanced down at his sleeve as though expecting to see the very smears Holmes had named, then gave a wan smile. "If you can read so much from such trifles," he murmured, "then I am indeed in the right hands." "It is from trifles that my bread is earned," Holmes replied dryly. "You spoke of your sexton, Carr. Tell me, has he the habits of a man who drinks?" "Carr?" The vicar shook his head. "No, I should trust him with the church plate in an unlocked chest. He takes a little ale at supper, no more. His wife, God rest her, kept him on a tight tether these 40 years. Since she died, he is lonelier, but not, I think, looser in his habits." "And his hearing?" "Not what it once was, naturally. But he is far from deaf." Holmes nodded, his lids drooping again. "Then we may perhaps discount drunken negligence," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "We shall see." The journey to Highgate seemed shorter than usual, perhaps because my mind was occupied in vain attempts to conceive by what conceivable mechanism a grave might move without the obvious signs of exhumation. By the time we turned up the hill and the outlines of a small stone church loomed ahead through the gloom, I had exhausted my imagination without satisfying it. St. Luke's was a modest, square-towered building of grey stone, set a little back from the road behind an iron railing. Beyond it, to the left, lay the churchyard, an irregular patch of ground, dotted with leaning stones and overshadowed by 3 ancient yews. A smaller enclosure at the far corner housed a low cottage, which I rightly assumed to be the sexton's dwelling. The carriage drew up at the gate, and we alighted. Holmes stood for a moment, his sharp features tilted upward, taking in the general arrangement with a long, comprehensive glance. The fog, though still present, had thinned somewhat upon the hill, permitting a clearer view than in the lower streets. "Observe, Watson," he said quietly, laying a hand upon my sleeve. "The approach, a single gate which, if locked at night, limits ingress to those with a key or the capacity to climb." The Reverend Chislehurst produced a ring of keys from his pocket and opened the gate, which creaked dismally on its hinges. "It is usually Carr who locks and unlocks," he remarked. "But I took the keys myself last night, as I meant to keep watch." We stepped within, the damp earth soft underfoot. Holmes paused at once, crouching to examine the ground inside the gate. I saw that the soil there was somewhat trodden, as might be expected in such a place, but beyond a few indistinct impressions I could see nothing that merited attention. Holmes, however, moved along the path with that peculiar, light-footed gait of his head bent, his eyes darting from point to point. Once he stooped to pick up a tiny object, which he slipped into his pocket without comment. Another time he ran a finger along the top of the low stone wall, as though testing for dust. "The grave, Mr. Holmes," the vicar urged, his voice betraying his anxiety. "You will wish to see it as it stands now." "In good time, sir," Holmes replied calmly. "We must first understand its surroundings, if we are to comprehend its motives in wandering." His lips twitched at his own conceit, but he moved now in the direction the vicar indicated, towards a patch of newly turned earth not far from the church's western wall. Even before we reached it, I could see that it matched the description we had been given, a rectangular mound of fresh soil with a temporary wooden marker at its head, bearing the name and dates of Sir Jasper Meekins. Holmes halted at the foot of the grave, his eyes sweeping over it with that swift, piercing scrutiny which I have seen make strong men uneasy. "You have not allowed it to be touched since this morning?" he inquired. "Not in the least," the vicar replied. "I forbade Carr to go near it until your arrival." Holmes nodded. "Excellent. We have then the scene as the culprit. human or otherwise, left it. He stepped carefully onto the path which ran beside the grave and knelt, his hands hovering over the surface without actual contact. I could see that the earth was indeed loose and dark, with the small irregularities one would expect from recent digging. Halfway down the length of the mound, a slightly larger clod of clay lay resting against the base of the marker, as though it had fallen there in the act of filling in. Holmes's eyes lingered on this little clod with particular attention. "You recall knocking such a clod away at the original burial, Mr. Chislehurst?" he asked. "I do. It had soiled the inscription." "And you observed the same arrangement when the grave first moved?" "Yes," the vicar answered slowly. "It struck me as unnatural, that it should fall in the same place twice." "Unnatural?" Holmes repeated softly. "On the contrary, it seems to me very natural if the same hand placed it so." I frowned, baffled. "Placed it, Holmes," I protested. "Surely it is just as likely that—" "Observe, Watson," he interrupted, pointing with one long finger. "The clod is not merely resting where it fell. See how it is wedged, almost as if it had been pressed into position. There is even a faint impression of a thumb at the side, though the rain has blurred it." I peered more closely, and was forced to admit that there was indeed a slight indentation, though how my friend perceived it so readily in that dim light was beyond me. Holmes rose and stepped back. "We must now examine the former sites," he said. "First, the original plot. Mr. Chislehurst, if you please." The vicar led us across the yard, skirting older graves, some tilted at drunken angles, until we reached a strip of turf near the western boundary. To my eye, there was nothing remarkable about it. The grass was of uneven height, with a few bare patches where the soil showed through, but certainly no sign that a grave had lain there only 3 days before. Holmes, however, went down upon one knee and drew a small pocket-knife from his waistcoat. With it, he gently lifted a corner of the turf. Beneath, the soil appeared compact and undisturbed. "Curious," he murmured. "Very curious." "What do you see, Holmes?" I asked. "Or, rather, what I do not see," he replied. "There is no sign here of recent excavation, no different striation of soil, no collapse where the earth has been insufficiently tamped down. If a grave lay here, then either it was dug very long ago, or someone has taken extraordinary pains to restore the ground to its previous state." He let the turf fall back into place and straightened, his face thoughtful. "Come," he said, "we must next view last night's theatrical performance, the intermediate position." As we followed him across the yard to the second site of the grave's appearance, a movement caught my eye at the far corner by the cottage. An elderly man in a worn coat and cap had emerged from the doorway, and now approached us with a slow, hesitant gait. His face was lined and weather-beaten, his grey beard clipped close, and there was a look of mingled curiosity and apprehension in his pale eyes. "That will be Carr," the vicar murmured. "Matthew," he called aloud, "this is Mr. Sherlock Holmes, who has come to assist us." The sexton touched his cap respectfully, though his gaze flickered quickly over Holmes's tall figure with the wary fascination of one who finds himself in the presence of a creature of legend. "I've heard tell of you, sir," he said in a hoarse voice. "If anyone can make sense of this unholy business, 'twill be you. For my part, I swear I've kept the gate as I always have, and if graves will walk on their own feet, it is no doing of Matthew Carr." Holmes regarded him thoughtfully. "No doubt, Mr. Carr," he said. "We shall talk at length, you and I, about what you have seen and heard these 3 nights past. But first I must let the graves themselves speak. They are often more eloquent than their guardians." With that, he moved towards the patch of ground where the second grave had stood, his manner calm, but with an intentness in his eyes which told me that the case of the shifting grave had already taken firm hold upon his singular mind. Holmes stepped lightly over the uneven grass as though he were crossing the drawing-room floor of some aristocratic residence rather than the damp hollow of a churchyard. His gaze swept the ground with swift, hawk-like precision, and though I followed as closely as the terrain allowed, I could perceive nothing beyond a faint patch of discoloured turf, its hue slightly more ochre than the earth around it. Reverend Chislehurst paused a respectful distance away, while Carr lingered farther still, as if unnerved by returning to the exact spot where the grave had last manifested. "This," the vicar murmured, pointing to a roughly rectangular outline, scarcely visible beneath the fog-thinned light, "is where the grave appeared yesterday morning. The marker lay at that far end, just there where the grass dips." Holmes was already kneeling, brushing his fingertips lightly over the flattened grass. "The soil here is older," he said quietly. "See how compact it is. The root structure of the grass remains intact. Nothing has been lifted or replaced, not recently at any rate." "But the grave stood here," the vicar insisted. "I saw it with my own eyes. The earth was as fresh as the morning's bread." "Indeed," Holmes replied, "and yet now it shows no sign that it ever yielded to a spade." He lifted a small tuft of grass and examined its underside. "Watson, observe, the roots are continuous, undisturbed. Had the turf been removed and replaced, the smallest fracture would be apparent. This ground has not been touched for months." I frowned. "But, Holmes, we saw fresh earth at the current site. Someone must have dug." "Someone has dug," Holmes agreed, rising to his full height. "But the question is not whether digging occurred, Watson. It is where, and more significantly, when." His eyes narrowed as he looked slowly around the churchyard. There is an economy to all human action, even that which masquerades as the impossible. If a grave appears to wander, then someone intends us to believe it walks. That intention must serve a purpose. The vicar passed a trembling hand across his brow. "But to what end, Mr. Holmes? If desecration were the motive, why replace the earth so perfectly? Why move the grave rather than violate it openly? Why—" "Because," Holmes interrupted gently, "the moving of the grave is the message, not the act itself, but the impression it leaves upon the living." Chislehurst paled. Carr muttered something under his breath, half prayer, half oath, and made the sign of the cross. Holmes took no notice of either reaction. He was already striding toward the stone wall that bordered the western edge of the yard. I followed at once, though not without casting one last bewildered look at the empty patch of ground from which, apparently, a grave had vanished without trace. The wall was low, no more than 4 feet, and overhung in places by the climbing tendrils of ivy. Holmes ran his hand along the top stones, pausing at one spot where the mortar was slightly lighter in colour. "Recently repaired," he murmured. "But not last night. Several weeks at least. Curious, yet tangential." He withdrew his hand and looked toward Carr. "Has anyone from the parish been using the grounds after dusk? Lovers meeting, perhaps? A trespasser seeking shelter? A naturalist hunting moths? Anyone to explain movement or shadow?" Carr shook his head emphatically. "Sir, these grounds are locked at 6 in the colder months. Nobody gets in after that unless I've let 'em in myself, and I've let no one in." "Have you noticed any signs?" Holmes asked. "Of someone climbing the wall? Scuffs, broken ivy, footprints near the base?" "None, sir," Carr replied. "And I'd have seen 'em." Holmes nodded as if the answer aligned with something already forming in his mind. Then, without warning, he turned sharply and strode toward the church itself. "Holmes?" I called, hurrying after him. "What do you expect to find there?" "An answer, Watson," he said simply. "Or at the very least, the edge of one?" The church, viewed closely, bore the marks of honest age, weather-softened stone, narrow diamond-paned windows, and a stout wooden door polished by countless hands and generations of worship. Holmes paused before this door, crouched, and examined the threshold. Then he did something exceedingly peculiar. He sniffed the air near the crack beneath it. "Do you detect it, Watson?" he asked. I bent, inhaling cautiously. "Only old stone and damp wood, perhaps a hint of incense." "Incense, yes," Holmes agreed, "but not from yesterday's service." He straightened, his expression sharpening. And there, faint, almost masked by the cold, I sniffed again and caught it, a trace, barely perceptible, of something bitter, metallic, and unpleasantly reminiscent of decay. "A body cannot be moved without some trace," Holmes said quietly. However careful the perpetrator. Chislehurst let out a soft gasp. "Surely you do not believe the coffin has been placed inside the church?" "No," Holmes said, "but something connected to it has passed this way, recently." He opened the door, and a dim, chill stillness greeted us. The nave was unlit, the pews silent shadows stretching toward the altar. Holmes moved forward with quiet purpose, his footsteps soft upon the stone floor. At the chancel rail he paused again, his eyes narrowing as he peered toward the vestry door. "Mr. Chislehurst," he said lowly, "does anyone besides yourself have access to the vestry?" "The sexton," the vicar replied, startled, "and our organist, Mrs. Pell, but neither has any reason—" "Every reason is concealed until one uncovers it," Holmes answered. "Watson, come." We crossed to the vestry, and the vicar unlocked the heavy oak door. The air inside was noticeably colder. Robes hung neatly from wooden pegs along the far wall. A desk stood beneath the small window, papers stacked tidily upon it. But Holmes' attention went at once to the stone floor beneath the window. The faintest dusting of soil, dark, loamy, unmistakably from the graveyard, lay near the base of the wall. "There," Holmes murmured, crouching. "Someone has stood here, recently and more than once." Chislehurst stared in astonishment. "But, Mr. Holmes, the window is never opened in winter, not unless for repairs." Holmes pressed his fingertips lightly to the stone. "And yet," he said, "the soil tells us someone did or attempted to." Carr hesitated at the doorway, cap twisting in his gnarled hands. "Sir, I mind a moment. 2 nights past, when I thought I heard something. A scrape, like stone upon stone. It might have been the wind, but—" "Why did you not mention this earlier?" Holmes asked without accusation. Carr swallowed. "Because I thought it were just noise, and because the grave— well, it were enough to fret a man's mind without me adding ghosts to it." Holmes stood, brushing his hands together lightly. "There are no ghosts here, Mr. Carr. Only men who depend upon fear and confusion to conceal their work." He turned to Chislehurst. "We must now inspect Sir Jasper's coffin." The vicar recoiled. "Exhume it? Today?" "Not fully," Holmes said, "but I must see the condition of the surface earth. If the coffin lies undisturbed below, that will tell me much. If it does not, Watson, I fear we are dealing with a plot of greater deliberation than a mere prank or act of spite." Chislehurst wavered visibly, torn between reverence and necessity. At last he nodded, his face pale but resolute. "Very well. I shall not hinder you. But, Mr. Holmes, what do you hope to find?" Holmes's reply was soft, but it carried a weight that chilled even me. "Not what I hope to find, Mr. Chislehurst. he said. "What I fear I already know." Holmes stood a moment longer in the vestry, his eyes narrowed, as though the faint trace of soil upon the stones were speaking to him alone. Then, with a sudden turn of purpose, he strode past Chislehurst and back into the churchyard. The vicar followed with visible reluctance, and Carr trudged behind, his shoulders hunched against the cold and, I suspected, against the weight of what Holmes might uncover. The grave lay silent beneath the lowering sky, its mound of earth still dark and moist from the recent digging. Holmes approached it with a steady, almost reverential gait, as though the ground itself were a witness whose testimony must be coaxed rather than forced. He circled the mound slowly, studying every angle, every slight variation in the pattern of the soil. "Watson," he said quietly, "observe how the earth settles. A grave newly filled will always slump a little as the weight compresses the soil below." I looked closely. The mound was indeed beginning to show faint dips along its length, subtle depressions that occurred naturally as earth settled over a coffin. "Normal enough," I remarked. "But what does it suggest?" Holmes tilted his head. "That the grave has held weight for at least several hours, not merely a shallow decoy. If there is movement here, it was not performed hastily in the early morning." Chislehurst swallowed. Then the coffin is still present?" "Indeed, present." "That," Holmes replied, "is precisely what we must test." Carr had brought with him a spade at the vicar's request, though he held it with visible reluctance. Holmes took it from him, testing the weight with one hand. "Only the uppermost layer," Holmes said. "A few inches, enough to see whether the coffin rests where we expect it to." Chislehurst murmured a short prayer under his breath. Holmes plunged the spade into the soil. The sound was oddly soft, drier than I expected, like the dull whisper of sand rather than the usual thick resistance of damp earth. He lifted a small shovelful and set it aside. Another followed, then a third. Then he paused. "Holmes," I said softly. He did not answer for several seconds. Finally, he knelt, brushing aside the loosened earth with his bare hand, revealing a patch of soil beneath that was lighter in color and oddly granular, as though sifted. He pressed his palm upon it, then, with a faint exclamation of interest, withdrew it. "Feel here, Watson. Tell me what strikes you." I crouched and placed my hand upon the exposed earth. To my surprise, it was warmer than the air around us, not warm in any lively sense, but not the chill one would expect from ground freshly turned on an October morning. "This is curious," I admitted, "as if the earth had been indoors or near a furnace." "Precisely," Holmes murmured. "This soil has been dried artificially and recently." Chislehurst stared, aghast. But why? Why in heaven's name would anyone dry the earth? What purpose could it serve? Holmes rose to his feet, dusting his hands together. "Because dry earth leaves fewer traces," he said. "It clings less to tools, it conceals footprints, it pours more readily. And, most importantly, it may be transported with ease." I felt a chill even deeper than the morning air. "Holmes, are you suggesting the earth itself was moved, carted, prepared beforehand?" Holmes gave a single sharp nod. "A staged grave, Watson, one prepared off-site, carried here, and laid atop a shallow cavity, if any cavity at all." Carr let out a low groan. "Then the coffin, Sir Jasper's coffin," Holmes turned to him, "is very likely not beneath our feet." The vicar pressed a trembling hand to his mouth. "Then it has been stolen," he whispered. "Taken. But for what end?" Holmes's reply was measured, almost reluctant. "That is the question which troubles me most." He handed the spade back to Carr. Cover it again, if you please. No further disturbance for now." Carr set to work at once, though his hands shook. Holmes walked a short distance away, and I followed, sensing he wished to speak privately. "Holmes," I murmured, "for what conceivable reason would anyone steal a coffin, and then go to such lengths to disguise the theft? Why the elaborate illusion of a wandering grave?" He tapped a long finger against his chin. "Think of the effort required, Watson. The earth dried, transported, 3 false graves prepared in advance, and placed with precision, the restoration of turf at the original site so flawless that even you, with your medical eye, could not detect the disturbance. Someone has gone to considerable lengths to mask their true intentions. But why? What could the body of Sir Jasper Meakins hold that warrants such labour?" Holmes gave me a sidelong look, thoughtful rather than cryptic. "That, my dear Watson, is precisely what we must learn." Footsteps approached. Chislehurst had overcome his initial shock and now stood near us, his face pale but determined. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "the niece, Miss Clara Meakins, should she be notified at once?" Holmes considered this. "We shall speak to her soon, yes, but not yet. First, we must understand more of the man whose grave we investigate." "And where shall we begin?" I asked. "By visiting his home," Holmes replied. "The house where Sir Jasper lived and died." Chislehurst nodded. "It lies a short walk from here, Meakins' house on Whitcomb Lane." "A modest estate. Excellent." Holmes retrieved his gloves, which he had tucked into his pocket. "But first, Mr. Carr, one last question, if I may." The sexton approached reluctantly. "You say the churchyard was quiet last night?" Holmes asked. "No footsteps, no lantern glow, no creak of gate or movement in the fog?" "None, sir," Carr insisted. Well," he hesitated. "There were bells." Holmes's attention sharpened instantly. "Bells?" "Aye, sir, just before dawn, soft-like, as though from far off. Not church bells, sir, not ours, nor any I've heard. More like—" he struggled for a word, "more like a tinkling, a signal, perhaps." Holmes glanced at me briefly, then back at Carr. "Did it occur the night before as well?" Carr nodded miserably. "Both nights." Holmes's expression did not change, but I sensed something click into place within his mind. "Then our next steps are clear," he said. "We go to Sir Jasper's residence." As we made our way toward the churchyard gate, I could not help glancing back at the mound of earth that had so convincingly mimicked a grave. Now I knew it for a veil, a carefully woven deception that hid the actions of a thief who had laboured under the cover of darkness and who had moved not merely soil but certainty itself. Holmes paused at the gate before stepping through, his voice low enough for only me to hear. "Mark my words, Watson, the disappearance of Sir Jasper's body is not the beginning of this mystery. It is the consequence. Something preceded it, something urgent enough to stir the dead." I shivered, though the cold alone could not explain it. "And until we learn what that something is," Holmes added, "the grave will not be the only thing that moves in the night." The climb toward Whitcomb Lane carried us through narrow, winding streets where the fog clung to the hedges like tattered wool. Holmes walked ahead with long, quick strides, his gaze flickering over every doorway, window and rooftop as though the very air might yield a clue if looked at sharply enough. Chislehurst kept pace beside me, silent except for the occasional strained breath. The revelations at the churchyard had shaken him profoundly, and he seemed unable to reconcile the sanctity of his parish with the cold deliberation of an unseen hand. At last the vicar raised a finger toward a break in the hedgerow. Beyond it stood a house of moderate size, square-built and dignified, its stone facade softened by age. The windows were shuttered on the lower floor, though one on the upper stood half open, A curtain stirred within by the weak morning breeze. "That is Meakin's house," Chislehurst said. "Miss Clara resides there still. Sir Jasper kept a modest household, only 2 servants." Holmes slowed, his eyes sweeping the building with quiet intensity. "A solitary man," he murmured, "with a solitary death, yet even solitude casts shadows." We approached the front gate, and Holmes paused to study the gravel path. At first glance the surface appeared undisturbed, but he bent low, brushing aside a thin scattering of autumn leaves. Beneath them lay impressions, faint but unmistakable, of recent footsteps leading both to and from the house. "Multiple visitors," Holmes said. "Not all at the same time, and not all wearing the same kind of boot." Chislehurst looked startled. "Visitors? But Sir Jasper has been dead for days. Only Miss Meakins and the staff should have been here." Holmes straightened, his mouth setting in a thoughtful line. "Yet someone has come, or comes still. The spacing suggests a man of average height, walking carefully, perhaps even stealthily. Look how the steps avoid the centre of the path and cling instead to the edges. Could that not be the milkman or postman?" I suggested. Holmes gave me a patient smile. "A postman walks briskly, Watson. His gait is clipped efficient. These steps are cautious. The spacing between them is too irregular for a routine delivery." His gaze sharpened. "And note the deeper impressions, each made by the ball of the foot first. A man carrying weight, perhaps, or moving with purpose." He moved on without elaborating, as though storing away the detail for later use. Chislehurst knocked gently at the front door. After a moment it opened, revealing a maid of perhaps 20, her eyes red from recent crying. "Mr. Chislehurst," she exclaimed, "Miss Clara will be glad you've come. She's in a dreadful state." "This is Mr. Sherlock Holmes," the vicar said, "and Dr. Watson. They have come to help us understand what has happened." The girl looked at Holmes with both awe and fear. "Yes, sir. Please, come in." She ushered us into a gently furnished drawing-room, where a young woman stood near the window. She was slender, with pale features, and dark hair pulled back into a modest knot. Her hands were clasped before her tightly enough that the knuckles were white. She turned as we entered, and Chislehurst stepped forward kindly. "Miss Meakins, allow me to present Mr. Sherlock Holmes." Her eyes, large and expressive, fixed upon Holmes with desperate hope. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice trembling, "the vicar told me you were coming. I pray you can help. I have hardly slept in 2 nights." Holmes bowed slightly. "You have my sympathy for your loss, Miss Meakins, and my assurance that we shall uncover whatever lies behind the strange disturbances at your uncle's grave." At this, she pressed one hand to her lips, fighting for composure. "It is dreadful, sir. Unspeakable. Uncle Jasper was a good man. Quiet, perhaps, but no harm to anyone. Why would anyone violate his rest?" Holmes motioned gently toward a chair, and she sank into it gratefully. He stood across from her, his hands clasped behind his back. "Before we address the grave, Miss Meakins, I must ask you about Sir Jasper himself. Anything unusual in his habits? Any recent anxieties, correspondence, visitors?" She shook her head slowly. "He seldom went out. Since returning from India, he lived quietly. He was sometimes," her brow furrowed, "troubled by memories, I think. He spoke little of his time abroad." "Did he keep papers, journals, letters from that period?" Holmes asked. "Yes," she said. "In his study upstairs. He kept the door locked at all times. I have not entered since his death. The key is here." She retrieved it from a small box on a nearby table. Holmes accepted the key but did not yet move. "Miss Meakins, did you notice anything unusual in the days before your uncle died?" Her eyes widened. Yes, there was something. 2 nights before his death, I heard him speaking with someone in the study. His tone was agitated. When I knocked, he dismissed me sharply and told me not to disturb him. Did you hear another voice? She hesitated. No, or at least I cannot be sure, but the next morning I found the curtains drawn tightly, though he usually rose early. His hand shook when he took his tea. When I asked what troubled him, he said nothing except that he had misplaced something of importance. Holmes's fingers drummed lightly against his coat. Did he explain further? No, he refused all questions, and that night he was dead. Holmes exchanged a brief glance with me, a glance I knew well. Something in that detail had resonated strongly with him. Miss Meekins, Holmes said gently, I must ask another question, one that may distress you. Did your uncle have enemies? Anyone from his past who might wish him harm? She thought long before answering. There was one person, she whispered. A man he knew in India. I do not know his name. But once, I remember this clearly, Uncle Jasper received a letter which disturbed him greatly. I brought it in with the post. He read it, turned pale, and burned it in the grate at once. When I asked who it was from, he said only, a man who should have stayed dead. Even Holmes seemed struck by this. And when was this letter received? He asked. 6 months ago, but Uncle spoke no more of it. Holmes nodded slowly, as though each word tightened the noose around some hidden truth. Miss Meekins, he said, may we have permission to examine Sir Jasper's study? Of course, she whispered. She rose and led us upstairs. The corridor was narrow, lined with fading portraits. At the far end stood a locked door. She handed Holmes the key. The lock turned with a stiff click. As Holmes pushed the door open, the smell reached us first, a faint, lingering trace of incense mixed with old paper and something metallic. Holmes stepped inside, his posture sharpening. The study was modest but meticulously organized. A large desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with neat stacks of papers. Shelves of books lined the walls. A small safe stood in one corner. Holmes went first to the desk, scanning it with rapid precision. Watson, he murmured, note the dust patterns. Certain objects were recently moved. I saw it now, areas where the dust was faint, interrupted or brushed aside. Miss Meekins swallowed nervously. I have not touched anything. Holmes nodded. Then someone else has. He opened a drawer. Empty. Another, also empty. A third contained only a single object, a folded, leather-bound notebook. Holmes lifted it reverently as though it might crumble. He opened it, and we leaned closer. The pages were filled with Sir Jasper's neat handwriting, but it was not the words that drew our eyes. It was a symbol repeated several times in the margins, a small, precise sketch of a bell. Holmes's breath caught so faintly I nearly missed it. A bell? I murmured. Like the sound Carr heard? Not like, Holmes said softly. The same. He lifted the last page and stopped abruptly. It was torn. As I feared, Holmes whispered. A missing page, recent, torn with haste. Miss Meekins clasped her hands together tightly. What does it mean, Mr. Holmes? What are these bells? Holmes closed the notebook, his face grim with understanding. It means, Miss Meekins, he said quietly, that whatever Sir Jasper feared in life has returned in death, and that someone is willing to move heaven, earth, and graveyard to claim what he left behind. He slipped the notebook into his coat. Come, Watson, our next step lies not here, but in the place where Sir Jasper died. And where is that? I asked. In this very house, Holmes said. In his bedroom, for it is there that the dead speak loudest, when a man's final hours are written upon the room around him. Miss Meekins blanched, but she nodded. "I shall show you," she whispered. And as we followed her down the dim corridor, I felt the unmistakable tightening of the mystery, like a rope, slowly, inexorably, drawing itself into a knot. Miss Meekins led us down the narrow corridor to a quiet room at the rear of the house. The door was half open, and Holmes paused a moment upon the threshold before stepping inside. I followed, and at once the peculiar stillness of the chamber struck me. It was not the ordinary hush of an unoccupied bedroom, but something heavier, an atmosphere that seemed to linger like breath held too long. The curtains were drawn back just enough to allow a sliver of pale daylight to cross the centre of the room. The bed, neatly made now, stood against the far wall. Beside it was a nightstand with a lamp and a small glass of water, its surface coated with a faint film of dust, untouched since Sir Jasper's final night. Holmes moved at once to the bedside, studying the layout with an intensity that Miss Meekins dared not interrupt. His gaze swept from the window latch to the floorboards, from the pillows to the carpet. Every few seconds he paused, tilting his head in that familiar manner which told me he was assembling hidden connections. "Miss Meekins," Holmes said without looking up, "did your uncle retire alone on the evening of his death?" "Yes," she replied softly. "I brought him tea at 8, as usual. He thanked me, though he seemed distant. When I wished him good night, he said nothing, merely nodded. And the door? I closed it, but did not lock it. Uncle Jasper disliked locked doors." Holmes's eyes flickered with interest. "Yet his study he kept locked." She nodded. "Always." Holmes straightened and crossed to the wardrobe. He opened it, revealing a modest collection of coats and waistcoats hung with meticulous precision. On the floor lay a pair of boots, shined, though scuffed at the heel. "Has anything been disturbed in this room since his passing?" Holmes asked. "No," Miss Meekins whispered. "I have not had the heart to change anything." Holmes glanced at me. "Excellent. Then the room may still speak." He knelt suddenly beside the bed, running his fingers along the underside of the frame. A faint sound escaped him, nearly inaudible, but I knew its meaning well. He had found something. "Watson," he murmured, "a candle, if you please." I retrieved the small bedside lamp and held it close. Beneath the bed, partially concealed against the far leg, was a small metal object. Holmes reached under and drew it out. It was a bell, no bigger than a closed fist, its surface engraved with intricate lines. Miss Meekins gasped. "I have never seen that before. Uncle Jasper kept no such ornament." Holmes turned the object over in his hand. The metal was darkened, though not by age, rather as if handled often. It bore the same symbol, sketched in Sir Jasper's notebook. Carr heard tinkling. Holmes murmured, "But this bell produces no ordinary chime. See here, Watson." He held the bell close to his ear and gave it the gentlest shake. No clear sound filled the room. Instead, a soft, muted vibration, almost felt rather than heard, thrummed faintly against the skin. It was uncanny, unsettling. "This," Holmes said, "is not a bell meant to summon the faithful, but to signal the fearful." Miss Meekins pressed a hand to her mouth. What was Uncle Jasper involved in? What could such an object mean? "That," Holmes replied, "I hope his desk may yet reveal. But here is proof enough that his death was not so ordinary as the physician believed." He rose, pacing slowly around the room. His gaze halted on the window. He pushed it open, testing the frame. It was unlocked, he observed. "Is this usual?" "No," Miss Meekins said. "Uncle Jasper never slept with the window open. He felt the damp worsened his lungs." "Yet someone opened it that night." Holmes murmured. From inside or outside? He leaned out, scanning the ground below. A narrow strip of earth ran along the rear of the house, bordered by low shrubs. He withdrew a magnifying lens from his pocket and examined the sill. "Watson, look here," he said. Scrapes. Tiny, but consistent. Metal upon stone. I bent, and indeed, thin lines marred the window frame, as if some implement had been slid beneath it, or lifted through it. Holmes moved his lens to the floor just below the window. There, barely perceptible to the naked eye, was a scattering of dark earth, the same colour as that which lay upon the spade-filled mound. Miss Meekins looked bewildered. "Are you saying someone entered his room that night?" "I am saying," Holmes replied, "that someone stood here after Sir Jasper died, perhaps even before." He crossed once more to the bed, pressing upon different sections of the mattress. "He lay upon this side," he said quietly, "and see, here the pillow is slightly depressed in a manner inconsistent with natural rest, as if his head fell sideways abruptly." Miss Meekins gave a strangled sob. "But the doctor said he passed peacefully." Holmes shook his head. "Peace leaves fewer marks." He drew back the sheet partially, revealing the mattress beneath. There, near the edge, was a faint stain, brownish, old. "Blood." Miss Meekins paled. "But he had no wound. The doctor said there was no evidence of struggle." Holmes touched the stain lightly with his fingertip. Not blood from a wound, dried blood that seeped from the nose or mouth after death, a common sign when the heart stops too suddenly. "A seizure," Miss Meekins whispered. "They said it was a seizure." Holmes gathered the sheet again and stood. A convenient diagnosis, and perhaps not incorrect. But the question, Miss Meekins, is what caused that seizure? She looked at him with wide, fearful eyes. "You mean he was killed?" Holmes made no immediate answer. Instead, he folded his hands behind him and began to question her again, now with greater urgency. "Was anything taken from this room after the doctor's visit?" "No. Nothing that I know of." "Anything added? Any object you did not recognize, aside from the bell we just found?" "No." Holmes nodded slowly, then crossed the room and opened a small writing table set against the wall. Most of the drawers were neatly ordered, stationery, ink, wax. But the bottom drawer, when Holmes pulled it open, was nearly empty. Only a square of felt lined the base, faintly indented in the shape of something rectangular. "A box once lay here," Holmes murmured. Miss Meekins frowned. "Yes, a small wooden case. Uncle kept it locked and never allowed me to handle it. After his death, it was gone. I assumed the doctor had removed it." Holmes' eyes gleamed. "What did the box contain?" She shook her head. "I do not know." "But he guarded it as though it held something precious, or dangerous. Did you ever see him open it?" "Once," she said. "By chance. He thought himself alone. When I entered, he shut it quickly. I caught only a glimpse of something wrapped in cloth." Holmes exhaled slowly, as though confirming a private thought. "And this box," he said, "is now missing." "Yes." Holmes walked once more toward the window and looked out across the lane. The fog was lifting slightly, and in the cold light his features appeared carved from steel. "Miss Meekins," he said, his voice low and controlled, "your uncle was threatened. He possessed something someone else wanted. They did not find it in life, so they sought it in death." She shuddered. "And the grave?" "An elaborate diversion," Holmes replied, "designed to confuse, delay, and frighten T. A moving grave draws attention outward, to the churchyard. Meanwhile," his eyes returned to the window, "the true work occurs within these walls." I felt a chill settle over me as Holmes stepped past us toward the corridor. "Holmes," I said quietly, "where are we going now?" "To find the man who visited this house 2 nights before Sir Jasper's death," he replied, his voice taut with urgency. "The man whose footsteps lead to and from this gate. The man whose bells shook the sexton's sleep." He looked at Miss Meekins with a mixture of resolve and sympathy. "And the man," he finished, "who believes Sir Jasper left behind something worth killing for." Holmes moved with sudden purpose, his coat flaring slightly as he strode back down the corridor. I followed, offering what comfort I could to Miss Meekins before joining him at the foot of the stairs. The look on his face was one I had seen many times before, an expression sharpened not merely by deduction, but by the unmistakable scent of a chase. "Holmes," I said quietly, "you believe the intruder is someone known to Sir Jasper?" "I believe," Holmes replied without breaking stride, "that Sir Jasper feared this man enough to hide whatever lay within that missing box, and I further believe the man returned to claim it, but arrived too late." "Too late? For what?" "To prevent Sir Jasper from taking his secret to the grave." We emerged once more into the drawing-room, where Miss Meekins sat rigidly, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles shone white through the skin. She looked up at us with desperate eyes. "Mr. Holmes," she whispered. "What will you do now?" Holmes regarded her gently. "There is much still to uncover, Miss Meekins, but for the moment you must answer one last question. Who besides your uncle and yourself knew of the wooden box?" She hesitated only a moment before shaking her head. "No one. He never spoke of it. And I barely dared ask." Holmes nodded as though this confirmed something rather than dismissed it. "Very well," he said softly. "For now you are safe. The person who seeks the box believes it buried with your uncle. But when they discover it is not—" She blanched, and Holmes added at once, "I shall take precautions. You will not be left unprotected." Her trembling eased, though only slightly. With that assurance, Holmes turned toward the maid, who stood anxiously in the doorway. "Mary," he said gently, "has anyone visited the house these past 3 days? Anyone unexpected?" The girl thought a moment. "Only the man from the undertaker's, sir. And a stranger what came on the morning after Sir Jasper passed. He asked after Mistress Clara, but when I said she was resting, he left without leaving his name." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Describe him." She bit her lip. "Tall, sir, thin, wore a long dark coat. His voice was rough, like he'd taken cold or hadn't spoken much in years." "And his manner?" "Urgent, sir, as if he wished to enter the house whether welcome or not." Holmes exchanged a significant look with me. "Thank you," he said to the maid. "You have helped greatly." With that, he motioned toward the door, and we stepped back out into the cold Highgate air. The fog had begun to lift, though the sky remained heavy with the threat of rain. Holmes paused halfway down the garden path, his eyes fixed upon a hedge near the gate. "Holmes?" I asked, following his gaze. "The leaves, Watson," he murmured. "See the break in the pattern? Someone has pushed through recently." I bent to look. Indeed, the hedge was disturbed, leaves bent inward, stems broken, as though a man had forced his way through rather than risk using the main gate. Holmes crouched, brushing aside the topmost leaves. Beneath them lay the faint imprint of a boot heel, deep enough to reveal its shape, shallow enough to indicate stealth. "Large foot," Holmes noted. "Worn edges and the soil, see here, mixed with a darker clay not native to this side of Highgate." "You mean," I said, "our intruder came from elsewhere?" "Precisely." And he wished to avoid being seen. Holmes rose and inspected the ground outside the hedge. A second impression lay in the gravel, barely visible from the path. He left abruptly, Holmes said. Perhaps he feared being discovered, or perhaps he heard something. Heard what? I asked. Holmes gave a small, grim smile. You forget, Watson, that the vicar was walking the churchyard that night. And though our intruder may not have known who was abroad, he would not risk being caught so near the house. He turned suddenly, his energy renewed. We returned to the churchyard. To the grave? I asked. No, Holmes replied. To the vestry. We retraced our steps through the village until the church rose once more through the thinning fog. Carr was still tending to some chore near the gate, though he straightened at once when he saw us. Mr. Holmes, he called anxiously. You're back sooner than I reckoned. Holmes nodded, striding past him without hesitation. Tell me, Carr, is the vestry window ever unbolted from the inside? Carr scratched his beard. Not as a rule, sir. It sticks something awful. But if a man were determined, he might force it. Holmes finished. Within the vestry, Holmes went straight to the window and pressed gently upon the frame. It shifted with reluctance, opening no more than an inch. But it opened. I see, Holmes murmured. So an intruder could have entered the church by night. Entered? I exclaimed. But would he not risk being seen? Not if he chose the darkest hour, Holmes replied. Or if he had reason to believe the sexton slept soundly. Carr looked abashed at this implication, but Holmes gave him a reassuring nod. You are not at fault, Carr. No man can watch every shadow. He returned his attention to the narrow window. Yet if the intruder entered the church, the question becomes, what did he seek here? Why disturb the graveyard rather than simply break into the house? I felt a sudden spark of understanding. The bell, I exclaimed. Sir Jasper's bell was hidden in his bedroom. Perhaps there were more, perhaps kept in the church. Holmes looked at me with approval. Not improbable, Watson. If Sir Jasper believed the church more secure than his home, he may have concealed something here. He moved swiftly to the wall behind the altar, a place seldom touched, except by the clergy. His fingers traced the stonework with delicate precision. Ah, he murmured suddenly. Here. He pressed firmly against a stone no larger than his palm. It shifted inward with a soft click. A hidden recess opened. Inside lay empty space. Holmes stared at it for a long moment. Empty, I whispered. Yes, Holmes said softly. And emptied recently. The edges of the dustline are sharp. Something rectangular rested here, something removed within the last 48 hours. The box, I said. Sir Jasper's missing box. Holmes nodded slowly. Taken from here. Not from the house. So Sir Jasper did hide it in the church, I said. But why? Holmes exhaled. Because he believed it safer here, and he was wrong. Chislehurst looked utterly stricken. Then the thief, he entered the church, rifled the recess, and only afterward turned to the grave. Holmes shook his head. No, he took the box first, and then, realizing Sir Jasper was dead, he sought to learn whether the old man might have hidden copies or instructions with his body. He expected the grave to contain what the recess had not. And when he failed to find it? I asked. He made the grave move, Holmes said, to hide his trespass and delay our recognition of his true purpose. A heavy silence fell. Holmes, I said finally, do you know what was in the box? Holmes closed the recess gently. I do not yet know, he replied. But I know this much. The man who took it has not finished his work. He will return. And when he does, we must be waiting. He turned toward the church door with decisive urgency. Come, Watson, he said. Our next task is to find the man whose bells wake the dead." And as we followed him out into the fading fog, I felt the unmistakable thrill of the net drawing tighter, though whether around the culprit or around us I could not yet say. Holmes set a brisk pace as we left the churchyard behind, his stride long and purposeful, his head angled slightly forward as though his thoughts tugged him onward. The fog had thinned to tatters, but the air remained cold, sharp with the promise of further revelations. I matched his pace, though with considerably more effort, while Chislehurst followed behind, breath visible in faint, white bursts. "We must find the trail while it is still warm," Holmes said without looking at either of us. "Our intruder believes he has deceived us with his theatrics in the graveyard, but he has miscalculated. All deceptions leave shadows." "And where do those shadows lead?" I asked. Holmes glanced briefly at me. "To the only place a man on foot could reach so swiftly after fleeing Meakin's house, a place secluded enough for planning, quiet enough for listening, and close enough for retreat." He stopped abruptly at a fork in the lane. To our right, the road curved toward the village proper. To the left, a narrow path descended between two tall hedges, their branches bowing inward like the ribs of some great creature. Holmes pointed left. "This footpath runs along the rear boundary of several Highgate properties, including Meakin's house. An intruder slipping through the hedge would take this route to avoid the roads." Chislehurst looked uneasy. "It leads down toward the abandoned rectory, Mr. Holmes. But surely nobody—" "Every nobody," Holmes cut in, "is somebody to a mind that seeks concealment." We followed him down the path. Damp leaves muffled our steps, and the faint smell of moss rose from the earth. Holmes paused often, crouching to inspect a broken twig. A crushed leaf, a faint scuff in the dirt. "You see, Watson," he murmured, "the heel impressions deepen here. He was moving faster. Fear does that. Our intruder realized someone approached the house. That knowledge hastened his flight." "And he came this way," I said. Holmes touched a broken branch. "No doubt of it." The path widened near the bottom of the hill, revealing a small clearing before a crumbling stone building, the abandoned rectory. Its windows gaped like empty eye sockets, and ivy clung to its walls in thick green ropes. The roof sagged in one corner, and half the garden wall had collapsed inward. Holmes stopped and surveyed the ruin in silence. Chislehurst shuddered. "It has been deserted these 20 years. Rats inhabit it now. No person in their right mind would take shelter there." Holmes gave a faint, humorless smile. "A perfect hiding place, then. Criminal ingenuity often flourishes where respectable men refuse to tread." He approached the front door, or what remained of it, and examined the rusted hinges. One was loose, the wood around it freshly split. "This was opened recently," Holmes said, "with force, but not wanton destruction. Someone pried it inward only enough to slip through." I leaned closer. "Holmes, are you suggesting the intruder used this place as a temporary lair?" Holmes did not answer directly. Instead, he stepped inside. The air was stale and cold. Dust floated like drifting motes in the thin light that filtered through the broken roof. The floorboards creaked under our weight. Holmes raised a hand for silence. Then he pointed. A set of footprints, faint but undeniable, disturbed the dust across the floor. They led from the door toward a small room at the back of the rectory. Holmes followed them without hesitation, and we trailed behind, scarcely daring to breathe. In the back room, the air was thicker, tinged with an acrid smell that reminded me of burnt cloth. The floor bore additional prints, heavier, more erratic, as though the intruder had paced while waiting or working. Against the far wall, beside a collapsed chair, lay a small heap of ash. Holmes knelt immediately, sifting the ash gently through his fingers. "Paper," he murmured, "and linen, recently burned." He lifted something small from the centre of the pile, a fragment not fully consumed. I bent to look. It was a remnant of cloth, and upon it, faint but still visible, the same symbol we had seen in Sir Jasper's notebook, the bell. "Holmes," I breathed, "this confirms it. Whatever was in Sir Jasper's box, the intruder found it and destroyed it." Holmes shook his head. "Destroyed part of it, yes, but only part." He held up another fragment, this one stiff, as though coated with something, a corner of paper perhaps. The ink was smeared and the edges charred, but Holmes turned it toward the light, studying it with acute concentration. "This was written in haste," he said softly, "and torn from a larger sheet. Not burned intentionally, but caught in the flames of whatever else he meant to destroy." Chislehurst approached timidly. "Can you discern it, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes tilted the fragment. "Only a few words, but enough." He read them aloud. "Bury it beneath until he returns. Bell will summon. The oath remains." The vicar's hand flew to his mouth. Good heavens! I felt my pulse quicken. "Holmes, this speaks of some pact, a secret society, perhaps? Something Sir Jasper believed would follow him beyond death?" Holmes rose, the fragment still held delicately between his fingers. "Not beyond death, Watson. Into it." He walked the perimeter of the room, eyes scanning the walls, the floor, the ceiling, though I could not imagine what more he sought. After a moment, he stopped near a narrow window and tapped the sill. The dust was disturbed. A small metallic glint caught the weak daylight. Holmes retrieved it. It was another bell, smaller than the one found under Sir Jasper's bed. Its surface was worn, the engraving nearly rubbed away, but unmistakable. Chislehurst backed a step, visibly shaken. "Why scatter them? Why leave bells in two places? What purpose?" Holmes turned the object in his hand. "To signal the faithful," he murmured. "Or to warn them? Or perhaps—" Then his eyes sharpened. "To test whether Sir Jasper had passed the object on, whether he left instructions, whether the oath remained." He pocketed the bell carefully. "But this bell, Watson, tells us something most crucial." "What is that?" Holmes faced us with acute seriousness. "That our intruder did not find what he sought." "But he burned what was in the box," I protested. "Part of it," Holmes repeated calmly, "but half a clue is more dangerous than none at all, and half a secret more compelling." He moved toward the exit with renewed urgency. Chislehurst called after him, "Mr. Holmes, where now?" Holmes did not slow. To those who knew Sir Jasper in his final years, those who may have heard echoes of this mysterious oath. He reached the doorway and turned briefly back to us. "And above all," he said, "to the man whose arrival Sir Jasper feared most, the one he called a man who should have stayed dead." I felt the weight of the words settle heavily in the room. "Holmes," I said, "do you believe this man still walks London?" Holmes gave a single, grave nod. "Not merely walks, Watson, he hunts." And with that, we stepped out into the failing afternoon light, straight into the tightening snare of a mystery far darker than a wandering grave. Holmes left the abandoned rectory with such determined swiftness that I had to lengthen my stride considerably to keep up with him. Chislehurst, still pale from the discovery of the torn inscription, and the second bell, followed with the weary uncertainty of a man suddenly thrust into the shadows of someone else's long-buried sins. The sky above Highgate had deepened to a dull iron grey, one of those oppressive London afternoons when twilight seems eager to arrive before its time. Holmes spoke only once as we retraced our path toward the village, and then merely to himself. "A man who should have stayed dead," he murmured, a phrase seldom uttered lightly. We reached the more populated lane, where cab wheels clattered distantly, and the scent of coal smoke drifted from nearby chimneys. Holmes stopped beside a wrought-iron fence and turned sharply toward the vicar. "Mr. Chislehurst," he said, "I must ask, were there any unusual visitors at your church during Sir Jasper's final weeks? Foreigners, perhaps? Or men who asked after him specifically?" Chislehurst pressed a hand to his brow, thinking. "Now that you mention it, there was one. A gentleman, though I hesitate to use the word, came to St. Luke's not long before Sir Jasper's death. He attended no service, but lingered outside after morning prayers. His manner put me ill at ease." Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Describe him." "Tall, though stooped, a gaunt face, dark eyes that never met one's own, and his hands, I recall them distinctly, thin, scarred as though burned long ago." Holmes exchanged a quick look with me. "And his name?" "He would not give it," Chislehurst replied. "He said only that he sought an old acquaintance and would return when the time was right." Holmes's expression hardened with satisfaction. "Then we have our phantom." We continued toward the main road. Holmes walked slower now, not from fatigue but from calculation. He was arranging the pieces of the puzzle with visible care. "Watson," he said, "recall the fragment we found in the ashes. Bury it beneath until he returns. Bell will summon. The oath remains." A directive, likely part of a larger set of instructions. And Sir Jasper hid those instructions in the church, a place his tormentor would not immediately suspect. "And the bells?" I asked. "What part do they play?" Holmes tapped his fingers lightly against his coat pocket, where the small engraved bell now rested. Symbols of recognition, perhaps, or signals between members of a clandestine brotherhood. Bells have long been used in secret societies as tokens of allegiance. "You believe Sir Jasper was involved in some cabal?" Holmes gave a faint nod. "In India, Watson, he may have crossed paths with a group of men bound by oath and ceremony. Men whose secrets were safeguarded by threats both metaphoric and literal." Chislehurst shivered. "But why return now? Why disturb his grave?" Holmes looked out across the street, his gaze narrowing. "Because Sir Jasper broke the oath, and men who build their identity upon oaths do not tolerate betrayal." We had reached the crest of a hill overlooking Highgate village when Holmes came to an abrupt halt. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, fixed upon a solitary figure standing near a lamp-post further down the street. "Watson," he said softly, "do you see the man by the post office?" I followed his gaze. A tall, thin man in a dark, threadbare coat stood half-turned from us. His posture was rigid, and though he appeared to be watching the road, his attention felt curiously taut, as though he were listening rather than looking. "Yes," I said. Do you think—" "I do," Holmes murmured. We advanced slowly. The man's hair hung lank on either side of a narrow face. His hands were thrust deep into his coat pockets, but even at a distance I saw the way his shoulders stiffened as we neared. Holmes signalled for Chislehurst to lag behind us, and he approached the stranger with the smooth, unhurried confidence that often lulled adversaries into underestimating him. "Good afternoon," Holmes said in a tone of polite detachment. The man turned his head slightly, revealing a profile carved with deep, weathered lines. His eyes, dark, sunken, and strangely unfocused, slid over Holmes without curiosity. "Do I know you?" he rasped. Holmes's reply was deceptively mild. "Not yet, but we have business, you and I." A subtle tremor passed through the man's shoulders. "I've no business with you." Holmes stepped closer. Then perhaps with Sir Jasper Meekins. The man's reaction was swift and absolute. His breath caught audibly, and his head snapped toward Holmes with sudden intensity. A flicker, fear or fury, ignited behind his eyes. Holmes pressed his advantage. "He is dead." The man's lips parted, but no words came forth. "And," Holmes continued softly, "his grave has not remained still." At this, the stranger recoiled a half-step, his hand tightening inside his coat pocket, as though grasping something hidden. Holmes's voice lowered. "Put your hand where I can see it, sir." But instead the man bolted. It happened in an instant. He turned sharply and sprinted down the road, his long legs eating the ground with startling speed. "After him, Watson!" Holmes cried, and we gave chase. The man dashed through a market stall, overturning a crate of apples. A fruit cart toppled in his wake, forcing us to leap aside. He sped past startled pedestrians, weaving with desperate agility. Holmes was remarkably swift, but the stranger seemed driven by something primal, fear sharpened into flight. We raced down a sloping lane toward the outskirts of the village, our breath steaming in the cold air. The man glanced back once, his expression distorted with something far sharper than panic, something nearer to fanaticism. He darted into a narrow alley between two brick buildings. "Careful!" Holmes called, but he plunged after him without hesitation. I followed, though my lungs burned. The alley ended at a small courtyard, a dead end. Our quarry skidded to a halt. He spun, cornered at last, his chest heaving. Holmes approached steadily, hands raised in a gesture of calm. "You cannot run forever," he said gently. "Tell us what you seek. Tell us what was in Sir Jasper's box." The man's eyes gleamed with a feverish light. "He broke the oath," he whispered hoarsely. "He promised it would stay buried." Holmes took another step. "What was buried?" The man shook his head wildly. "I saw the grave moved. I saw the signs. It was him, calling it forth." "Nonsense," Holmes snapped. "Sir Jasper calls nothing." The stranger pressed his back against the brick wall, trembling. "The bell calls," he whispered. Holmes' gaze sharpened. "And what does it summon?" The man's face twisted. "Judgment." Holmes moved forward, and in that instant the man lunged for the opposite wall, grabbing a loose pipe. It tore free with a metallic scream. Before Holmes could reach him, the man hurled himself upward, scaling the bricks with frenzied strength. "Holmes!" I cried. But the stranger had already pulled himself onto a low roof and vanished over its far side. We reached the wall too late. The rooftops beyond were a maze of chimneys and sloping tiles. No sign of him remained. Holmes stood perfectly still, breath only faintly quickened, eyes alight with cold fire. "A fanatic," he said, "a zealot bound to a dead oath, and now he knows we are close." He turned sharply toward me. "Quickly, Watson, we must return to Miss Meekins at once. If our man fails to find what he seeks in the grave or the church, he will search the living next." A chill gripped me. "You believe Miss Meekins is in danger?" Holmes was already moving. "I believe," he called back, "that the next grave disturbed will not be her uncle's." Holmes set off at such a pace that even I, accustomed as I was to his sudden bursts of velocity, found myself struggling to keep abreast. The village blurred past us, lamp-posts, shop fronts, startled pedestrians, all swept aside by Holmes's immediate and overwhelming urgency. His mind had leapt ahead, and his body merely followed the course he had already charted. "Holmes," I called breathlessly as we bounded up the rise toward Whitcomb Lane, "what precisely do you fear will happen?" "That our adversary," Holmes replied without slowing, "emboldened by desperation and cornered by circumstance, will act with the recklessness of a man convinced he serves a higher purpose. And Miss Meekins is the only living soul who may have glimpsed or handled Sir Jasper's secret. Whether knowingly or not, she now stands between this fanatic and what he seeks. A dread tightened my stomach. Clara Meekins' fragile demeanour, her trembling composure, seemed wholly unequal to the danger Holmes now envisioned. We quickened our pace, and the gates of Meekins' house came into view at last. The front door stood ajar. Holmes halted so abruptly that I nearly collided with him. "No good comes of a door left so," he murmured. Then he added sharply, "Quietly now, Watson." We crept across the gravel path, every crackle beneath our feet sounding louder than thunder in the tension of that moment. Holmes pushed the door open with the tip of his cane. The entry hall lay in shadow, still, silent, and unsettlingly empty. Holmes lifted a hand, signalling for me to remain close behind him. We slipped inside, and Holmes closed the door softly to prevent any escape behind us. The house felt colder than it had earlier, as though warmth had fled before us. "Miss Meekins?" Holmes called softly, not loudly enough to betray alarm, but with clear intent. No answer. We moved toward the drawing room. Empty. The curtains shifted faintly in a draught that should not have existed. "The window there," Holmes whispered, pointing to a casement now open by 2 inches. "He entered through here before. He has done so again." We ascended the staircase with utmost caution. At the landing, a faint sound reached us, barely audible, yet distinct. A muffled sob. Holmes's eyes met mine for an instant. Then he moved silently toward the source. It came from Sir Jasper's study. Holmes eased the door open. Miss Meekins sat upon the edge of her uncle's desk chair. Her face buried in her hands. Her breathing was uneven and she trembled from head to foot. Mary, the maid, stood beside her, wringing her apron anxiously. Holmes exhaled the faintest breath of relief. But before he could speak, Miss Meekins lifted her head, revealing eyes wide with terror. "Mr. Holmes," she gasped, "someone was here. I heard footsteps in the corridor not 10 minutes ago. Heavy ones. I thought it was Mary, but when I called out, there was no answer. Then I heard something fall upstairs." Holmes went still as carved stone. "Upstairs?" he repeated quietly. "Yes, in Uncle Jasper's room." Holmes drew a deep breath. "Watson, come." Before Miss Meekins could object or Mary cry out, Holmes had already vanished into the hall. I followed, heart racing. We climbed the remaining stairs swiftly. The corridor above was darker, curtains drawn, doors closed. Holmes stopped outside Sir Jasper's bedroom door, which was now shut despite having been left open earlier. He placed his hand lightly to the wood and nodded. "Someone is inside." "Holmes," I whispered urgently, "if it is our quarry, he may be armed or desperate." "I rely upon the latter," Holmes murmured. "Desperation clouds judgment." He turned the knob in a single fluid motion and thrust the door inward. What greeted us was not the intruder, but evidence of his presence. The mattress had been torn open with some sharp implement, stuffing strewn across the floor. Drawers were emptied, their contents scattered. The wardrobe hung open, garments pushed aside violently. The shutter at the window swung inward in the rising breeze, but the room was empty. Holmes strode inside at once, surveying the destruction with grim certainty. "He searched for the missing half," he murmured. "He found nothing, and so he fled." "To where?" I asked, scanning the shadows. Holmes approached the window. "Not far. He did not leave by the stairs. Miss Meekins would have heard him. Look here." A thread from a coat, dark wool, caught on the jagged hinge of the shutter. "He climbed out," Holmes said. "Down onto the garden trellis. There is damp soil below. If we are fortunate, he left tracks." He climbed halfway through the window before pausing just long enough to say, "Watson, if he has lost all subtlety, he may attempt to reclaim the box's contents by force." "Meaning Miss Meekins?" Holmes nodded. "She must not be left alone." I hurried back downstairs while Holmes descended the trellis with the feline agility he applied to all things requiring balance. When I reached the drawing room, Miss Meekins cried out in relief at my return. "Is he caught?" she asked. "Not yet," I replied, "but Holmes is pursuing him. You must remain where you are and Mary with you." The maid nodded vigorously, positioning herself between her mistress and the door. Moments later, Holmes burst through the front door, his expression fierce with concentration. "He's heading toward the churchyard," he said. "The man believes something of value remains there, or that Sir Jasper's corpse itself may hold what he seeks." "But Holmes," I protested, "the coffin is gone." "Yes," Holmes said, "but he does not yet know that we know." We ran with him into the deepening dusk. The churchyard loomed ahead, those ancient yews bending like dark sentinels in the wind. As we approached the gate, Holmes halted abruptly and raised a hand. "Quiet!" We listened. A rustle, definite, though faint, came from the far corner near the boundary wall. Holmes's eyes narrowed, catching the direction at once. "There," he whispered. "He's tearing at the turf, searching for what he believes Sir Jasper buried with him." We crept closer, the dim light masking our approach. Silhouetted against the wall, a man knelt feverishly beside the false grave. His movements were wild, digging with his bare hands, casting soil aside in frantic bursts. His coat hung tattered, his breath came in ragged gasps. Holmes whispered to me, "Do not let him flee again." Then he stepped forward. "That will do," Holmes said sharply. The man froze. Slowly he turned toward us, his face gaunt, streaked with dirt, eyes burning with the fire of obsession. "You cannot stop it," he said hoarsely. "He made a vow, and the vow must be fulfilled." Holmes advanced another pace. "The vow is broken. Sir Jasper broke it. You seek something that is no longer here." The man's face twisted. "He hid it. He lied. He took it from us." "He took nothing," Holmes said. "You were deceived by the oath itself." The man grabbed something from the soil, a small cloth-wrapped object I had not seen before, and held it to his chest with a cry of triumph. "I have it!" Holmes stopped dead. "So," he murmured, "you did not find it earlier." The man rose slowly, clutching the object as though it contained the very essence of life. "You shall not take it," he said. "None shall." Before Holmes or I could reach him, he tore open the cloth. The object within gleamed dully in the moonlight, a small metal seal engraved with the very bell we had seen before. Holmes inhaled sharply. "Watson, careful. That seal may represent—" But his warning was too late. The man gazed upon the seal with rapture, then emitted a low, guttural sound, somewhere between laughter and sobbing. Suddenly, without warning, he staggered backward, as though some unseen force had struck him. His hand flew to his chest, his breath hitched, and then he collapsed. Holmes reached him in 3 strides and knelt, pressing 2 fingers to the man's neck. After a moment, Holmes exhaled slowly. "Dead," he said. I stared, stunned. "Holmes, how? What killed him?" Holmes lifted the metal seal, studying it with grim fascination. "Fear, Watson, or certainty, a heart already weakened by fanaticism and dread. When he found what he sought, what he believed was fated, his own mind delivered the fatal blow." He wrapped the seal once more in the cloth. The vow died with Sir Jasper, and now with him. We stood in silence as the wind whispered through the yews, carrying away the final echoes of the man's madness. Holmes rose, brushing soil from his hands. "It is finished," he said softly, "but the truth, entire truth, remains to be told. Back to Meakin's house. Miss Clara deserves to hear what shadow has hung over her family." And together, with the dead man lying among the ruins of his obsession, we walked back through the churchyard gate toward light, clarity, and the final unraveling of the mystery. Holmes and I returned to Meakin's house under the first touch of nightfall, the lamps along Whitcomb Lane flickering into life as a pale breeze stirred the branches overhead. The weight of the evening's grim encounter still clung to us, though Holmes bore it with that cool, implacable calm that so often concealed the rapid workings of his mind. Miss Meakins rose at once as we entered the drawing-room. Her hands were clasped tightly, her eyes wide with hope and dread intermingled. "Mr. Holmes," she whispered, "is it over? Have you found the man?" Holmes inclined his head. "We have, Miss Meakins. He will trouble you no longer." She exhaled shakily, but Holmes lifted a hand gently, signalling that more must be said before comfort could take root. "Please sit," he said, "for I must tell you the truth of your uncle's final days, and of the vow that bound him." She obeyed, with Mary standing protectively at her side. Chislehurst, solemn and attentive, sat near the hearth. Holmes remained standing, hands behind his back, his gaze sweeping across us before settling upon Miss Meakins. "Your uncle," he began, "became entangled years ago in India with a clandestine fraternity known colloquially as the Order of the Bell. Its members swore an oath of silence surrounding certain political intrigues and misdeeds, an oath sealed by a symbol and upheld by a threat." He drew from his pocket the metal seal wrapped in cloth and placed it upon the table. "This," Holmes said, "was their emblem of allegiance and their instrument of judgment. Any man who broke their oath became the target of those sworn to uphold it." Miss Meakin's breath hitched, but Uncle Jasper did nothing wrong. He was a good man. Holmes regarded her with sympathy. He tried to leave. That alone, for such men, is betrayal. But he carried with him something more. Evidence of wrongdoing by one of their leaders. That evidence he concealed, first in the church recess, then elsewhere, intending that it never fall into the fraternity's hands. Chislehurst leaned forward. "Then that box, its contents exposed their crimes?" "Precisely," Holmes replied. "The intruder, the man we chased, was once a fellow member of the order, scarred, fanatic, determined to recover what Sir Jasper hid. He believed the missing evidence would destroy them, and so it would have." Holmes paused, his tone deepening. "2 nights before Sir Jasper's death, that man came to this very house. Sir Jasper refused him entry, and the confrontation left your uncle shaken. The next day he wrote down what he feared, instructions perhaps, or warnings, before hiding half in the church recess, the other half within his bedroom. But that night his heart, burdened by fear and frailty, gave out." Miss Meakins covered her mouth. "Then he wasn't killed?" "No, his death was natural. Tragic, but natural. Yet the fraternity's agent believed otherwise. He thought Sir Jasper had hidden the evidence with him in death, and thus began the ritualistic ruse of the moving grave." She shuddered. "But why move it? Why not simply dig?" "Because," Holmes explained, "the man sought secrecy. A disturbed grave arouses suspicion. A grave that appears to shift, on the other hand, invites fear, confusion, and delay, while obscuring the true purpose, repeated searches for the hidden evidence." Watson added softly. "When he found nothing, his desperation grew. And at last, tonight, He found the one thing Sir Jasper hid at the churchyard, the seal. Miss Meekins gazed at the object with revulsion. But it killed him. Holmes shook his head. Not the seal, his belief, his fanaticism. A heart already strained could not withstand the shock of believing he had faced divine judgment or fulfilled some unholy prophecy. The mind, Miss Meekins, can be a cruel executioner. Silence settled in the room like a soft cloak. At last, Miss Meekins spoke. "Mr. Holmes, the evidence my uncle hid, does it still exist?" Holmes gave a faint, approving smile. "It does. He did not entrust his secret solely to the recess or the grave. In his study, beneath the false bottom of the drawer from which the notebook was taken, I found a second compartment. That compartment held a sealed envelope containing Sir Jasper's account of the Order of the Bell, their crimes, their names, and his testimony. He wished no one harmed, but he wished the truth known." He placed the envelope gently upon the table. "It is yours now, to deliver where justice may be served." Tears welled in Miss Meekins' eyes, not of sorrow alone, but of relief, gratitude, and the lifting of a burden she had not known she carried. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes," she whispered. "You have restored my uncle's honour." Holmes bowed his head slightly. Outside, the church bells began their evening toll, real bells, warm and comforting, not the eerie chime of secret oaths. Chislehurst stood. "Mr. Holmes, the parish owes you more than gratitude." Holmes waved a hand lightly. "Nonsense. The case offered intellectual nourishment, and that is more than enough. Besides—" His eyes twinkled briefly. "I should think Highgate has endured quite enough peripatetic graves for 1 century." Miss Meekins managed a small, trembling smile. Holmes turned to me then, his expression softening with that rare camaraderie he reserved for our quietest moments together. "Come, Watson," he said, reaching for his coat. "The night grows cold and London awaits us. Perhaps Mrs. Hudson has kept supper warm." And so we left Meekins' house behind, its shadows dispelled and its secrets laid bare. As we descended the hill toward the city's glow, Holmes walked with the peculiar satisfaction of a man who has untangled a knot few others could see. "You see, Watson," he remarked, "the dead seldom walk, but the living may do so under the weight of fear, guilt, or devotion." He glanced sideways at me with a dry smile. "And it is our duty, yours and mine, to ensure they walk no further than truth allows." Thus ended the strange case of the grave that shifted overnight, an illusion born not of restless spirits but of restless men. And once more, under the dim lamps of Baker Street, I reflected upon the extraordinary mind of Sherlock Holmes, who saw beyond shadows and spectacles to the quiet, unwavering pulse of reason beneath.